Matthew 6:25, Jesus is giving us instruction. He says, do not be anxious about the things of your life. This is an instruction from Jesus. He's giving us a command here. And he says, look at the flowers, look at the birds in the air. They neither reap nor sow, and God takes care of them. All of their needs are taken care of. There's nothing for you to worry about. At the end of the day, he knows every hair on your head. He is all-powerful. He is the Almighty. He is all love, and he's all-knowing. He knows you, he loves you, and he's powerful enough, strong enough to take care of you and lead you to the place that you're created to end up. And so that's the justification for why we should not be anxious about the things of our life. At the same time, he's created us with this thing called the survival instinct. And part of that is what's built into our brain systems, the fight or flight system. Hey, and welcome to another episode of Being Human. I'm really excited to share with you today some thoughts on our next topic of interest in this series on mental health issues. Today we're going to be talking about anxiety and depression, both together because there are some overlaps that are important to look at. We're going to look at these things through a Catholic anthropology, a lens of integrated faith and science. And, this is something I think a lot of people really have a lot of questions about because it has to do with something that all of us experience sometimes on a day-to-day basis. But we don't all have a diagnosable disorder. So what's the difference? What do we do with this? How can we benefit from some people's experience who are really suffering with diagnosable disorders? And how can we use that for all of us to grow closer to God and become better versions of ourselves? That's what I'm going to be talking about today. So first, the normal disclaimer for any of these issues: this is not therapy. This is a podcast. Do not use this as therapy. Don't use this as a way to diagnose or self-diagnose any experiences that you may be having, or someone you love or are in relationship with might be having some of these experiences. It's not your job to diagnose them. And, we are available for more help. If you are experiencing some difficulties related to these issues, don't hesitate to reach out. You can find us at CatholicPsych.com, and you could find contact information there. And we can help you talk it out if maybe there is a need for sort of a step up into some more professional help or assistance. And as well, today we're going to be talking about depression, anxiety. One of the hallmarks of depressive disorder is suicidal thoughts and feelings. So if you do find yourself having any of those thoughts and you're not in control of them, but they seem to be starting to control you, do not hesitate to reach out for help. And I don't just mean calling up your friend, I mean call 911. When it gets to be an emergency situation, do not take your own safety or somebody who you are in relationship with safety for granted. And so calling 911 when there is an actual life or death situation where that is actually the worry is the right thing to do. Don't be afraid to ask somebody else if they're expressing to you some really dark depression, some deep thoughts of those kinds of things. We need to make it normal to just ask the question, are you thinking about hurting yourself or killing yourself? Because we all have all sorts of crazy ideas that go through our heads all the time. And when we keep these things in the dark, they can fester, they can grow. That's where the enemy does his best work in the dark. And he hates the light of truth and the light of Christ, and we need to love the truth, and we need to love the light. So don't be afraid to bring these things up. Ask others for help. Ask others if that's what they're going through. Let's make this normal to talk about these kinds of things and not be afraid of overreacting when it comes to our lives. All right, so why anxiety and depression together? Basically, we have to understand the way that God created us with our thoughts, our minds, the way that we can think thoughts, and what we do when we're aware or maybe not as aware of the kinds of thoughts that are running through our head. And at the heart of an understanding of what is an anxiety disorder or a depressive disorder are these ruminations, a lot of deep, deep thoughts. And more accessible in anxiety than sometimes in depression. Sometimes depression comes with a sort of cloudiness of mind that you're not really aware of the kinds of thoughts that are there, but they're there. There's definitely a lot of ruminating happening with depression. But first, let's take a step back. We have Matthew 6:25. Jesus is giving us instruction. He says, "Do not be anxious about the things of your life." This is an instruction from Jesus. He's giving us a command here. And he says, look at the flowers, look at the birds in the air. They neither reap nor sow, and God takes care of them. All of their needs are taken care of. There's nothing for you to worry about. At the end of the day, he knows every hair on your head. He is all-powerful. He is the Almighty. He is all love, and he's all-knowing. He knows you, he loves you, and he's powerful enough, strong enough to take care of you and lead you to the place that you're created to end up. And so that's the justification for why we should not be anxious about the things of our life. At the same time, he's created us with this thing called the survival instinct. And part of that is what's built into our brain systems, the fight or flight system. This is, and sometimes fight, flight, or freeze system. And this is the sympathetic nervous response. That's a fancy way of saying when we perceive a threat, our brain goes into a safety mode or a self-protection mode. And it gets us ready. Through our mind, we trigger things in the brain that triggers things in the body to get us ready to fight, to run, or to freeze up, like play dead if the bear is coming at you. And I don't know, I always say that as an example, and I never actually know if that's really what you're supposed to do. But anyways, that's what I grew up thinking. You're supposed to play dead if there ever is a bear coming after you. So, but this is happening in the brain because of what the mind is interpreting based on what's coming through our senses, and it turns us into, this other kind of human. We're not using all of our resources. And studies show there's not as much creativity in the brain. There's not as much empathy. There's not as much self-awareness. There's not as much environmental awareness. There's all things that are happening. All these things are happening because all of the resources are diverted towards getting the body to run away from a threat, to fight off the threat, or to shut down and freeze as a way of self-protection when there's a threat. So the sticky part here, the sort of difficult thing here that we're vulnerable to is the mind. The mind sits in the middle of all of this. So we have reality out there, then we have our internal biology in here, and the mind is this gatekeeper, which is passing information from the environment to the internal biology. And that mind can have a mind of its own. It's not always doing its job correctly, only sending information about actual environmental threats. That's its job. But a lot of times the mind will come up with all sorts of other threats that are not actually in the environment. And this is where we get deep, 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 deep into psychology. And this is where we start to understand how, we think, our narratives, the things that are conscious, things that are unconscious, things that are from memory, things that are from imperfect and flawed memory, things that are happening from the past that we haven't been able to process and resolve. Lots of different things. We could go off in all sorts of directions from this point. But we're just doing a basic overview right now. Because that mind can input or inject an interpretation of a threat. It's a real or perceived threat that can trigger that fight or flight sympathetic nervous response. So this is the work of psychology, to get into where the mind is, where we're coming up with these thoughts, where we're thinking these thoughts, where we're choosing with the will whether or not to actually pay attention to these thoughts. There's a lot of work to be done there. But when we don't, and we're sort of on autopilot, and we're just letting these thoughts run wild, then it triggers all of these sympathetic nervous responses, and then that becomes a real problem. Okay, so we're going to come back around to the end talking about abandonment to divine providence and what we can do on a normal basis, whether we have a diagnosable disorder or not because it's going to make the disorders go away, but how we can actually live our best life, given our circumstances, whatever those circumstances might be. There's going to be a best version of ourselves that we're able to live with our shortcomings, our limitations, even our diagnosable diseases and physiological disorders that we might have. So we want to look at all these things. I think what would be helpful, what I wanted to do for today too, is give people a sense of what is a diagnosable anxiety disorder or a diagnosable mood disorder. Depression is a form of what's called a mood disorder. And so, because everybody has bad days, everybody feels sadness, everybody feels anxious, everybody's minds can run away with them, and we start going off on these different rabbit trails. So when does it become a diagnosable issue? That's what we want to look at. And there are criteria. So there are uses to certain diagnostic manuals for physicians, for doctors, for therapists, psychotherapists to be able to use in order to have a common understanding, a common ground to say, do we need some professional intervention? Do we need possibly some medicine intervention? And, we want to look at all those things. So we have this diagnostic criteria, and there's a lot of different kinds of anxiety disorders and mood disorders. But I want to start off with what's called generalized anxiety disorder, because this is kind of a catch-all, and this is not coming into like a specific kind of anxiety. So there's generalized anxiety disorder, and then there's specific things like phobias. I don't know if you ever saw, when I was growing up, the horror movie that I still have nightmares about today is arachnophobia. So the fear of spiders. And I think John Goodman was in that movie. He was the exterminator that crushed the spiders. But it's such a horrible movie. And so we have these specific phobias, anxiety about some particular thing. And then we have social phobias, which might have to do with being in public or being around other people. But again, these are like specified points of anxiety. And then also we've talked already in the series about obsessive compulsive disorder. That's in the anxiety family. Also trauma, PTSD is in the anxiety family. So these are all related things. But let's go back to what would be just the sort of generalized anxiety. And this is when there's a presence of excessive anxiety and worry, which in diagnostic terms, what that means is more than half the time, more times than not, is how it reads. So then more than 50% of your time when you're awake, more than half of your day, more than half of your thoughts, you have this excessive worry and anxiety about a variety of topics. It could be about anything. It could be about stuff with your kids, with your family. It could be upcoming activities. It could be jobs. It could be vocation. It could be current events and news. It could be all sorts of things. And it happens for at least 6 months. So it's got to be more than half the time and at least 6 months. And also, whenever something's diagnosable, it has an effect in your life that it's a significant impairment. And this means that, two people might have the same exact internal subjective experience of something, but for one person, it's not really affecting their life at all. Two people have the same exact headache, and one person just kind of powers through and doesn't really even think about it, and the other person is really suffering very deeply. And that's not to say anything about their subjective pain tolerance or anything like that, but just on the surface level, we see that one person has to call out of work, the other person doesn't. One person has to stay in bed, the other person doesn't. That has to be happening. There has to be an impairment of some sort in your vocational life, where you're working, your family life, your relationships, school, if you're in school. So that has to be there as well. So it's more than half the time, more than not. It's at least 6 months. It's this excessive worry. And then it's experienced as very challenging to control. So you can go in this generalized form, you're switching from topic to topic. And then there's at least 3 of these secondary symptoms or effects that are happening as well. So the other kinds of things that can happen, there might be a lot of irritability. There might be fatigue. There might be cloudiness or blank mind. You lose your train of thought. There might be a kind of restlessness. You might have increased muscle aches, physical pain, headaches, all sorts of kind of like weird soreness, weird things that are happening physically in your body like that. Or you might have difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep, or you might be waking up really early, or just feeling exhausted, even after a night where it seems like you slept through the night. So out of those 6 other secondary symptoms, you have to have at least 3 of those things also happening. So if you showed up to your doctor or to your psychologist and your presentation showed all of the above, then they would say, well, there's good indication that you may have a diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder. Then also, they're going to look at your medical history. You want to make sure that there's no medical reason why this might be happening, because a lot of these things might be triggered also by thyroid issues, heart issues. There's all sorts of other things that might be happening here. There's nutritional things that might be involved. One thing might be triggering another. I've heard of people with like mold issues and then they couldn't sleep, and then the sleep leads to the next thing and the next thing. So we want to see this holistically and systemically. But that's kind of the difference between somebody that's like, I've got a job interview coming up and I'm just like stressed out about it and I'm really worried and I keep thinking about it and it keeps playing over my mind over and over again and I lost a whole night of sleep, versus a diagnosable disorder, So we want to be careful. Well, we want to at least have that. Maybe it gives us peace to know that like it's kind of normal to have some of these normal experiences, but it doesn't have to be diagnosable or think of ourselves as disordered in that clinical kind of way. All right, then beyond generalized anxiety disorder, like I said, there might be a specific phobia. There might be panic disorder, which is where it sort of increases to a lot of physical symptoms of actually having a panic attack. And then it could be like OCD or PTSD like we talked about. Okay, so that's the anxiety side of things. Back over to depression. Now, depression also has a set of criteria that need to be in play to go from like I'm having a bad day or a bad week, or maybe it's just been a really bad month where there's been a lot of ups and downs, to like this is a little bit more serious. And this is now for depression, for these mood disorders, we're looking at a 2-week window. And during a 2-week window, we want to see depressed mood, like really intense sadness, which is one of the symptoms. But then besides that, we also see, and that's going to be like basically every day during those 2 weeks. And then you might have a loss of pleasure or interest in other activities, things that could be really fun or enjoyable. And a lot of times I see this really unfortunately because then in terms of family life, and then that adds to anxiety. And then that adds to inner critics, beating ourselves up. And we have all these stories because, it's not as enjoyable to be with our kids or, maybe a spouse or something is happening there. And, we find like internally there's like a switch was turned off. And what used to be really joyful and fun or pleasurable just isn't anymore. And so that could be really, really difficult for people to suffer with that experience because they actually love their family and they want to experience the joy that they know is possible and is good, and they probably have felt before. So that could be a really difficult aspect of this. Some of these other symptoms that we're looking for: significant weight loss, unintentionally when you're not dieting or trying to lose weight for some reason, or weight gain, also when it's unintentional. Or it could be just a decrease or an increase in appetite. So the whole sort of like eating system, metabolism, all of this is affected. There could be just a really depressed slowing down of thinking, of activity, just internally like really, really sluggish. And that could be also accompanied with fatigue where you're actually tired. So then you're just falling asleep a lot. feelings and thoughts of worthlessness or inexpressive and excessive guilt, feeling just the weight of life, the burdens, feeling like it's all your fault, feeling like you're at the center of just like the world crushing in on you. This is what it feels like for people with clinical depression. And this is, again, most days, nearly every day for at least a 2-week period of time to be diagnosable. People that are diagnosed and it's not treated or it's not decreasing over time, this is what they're living with every day. And it's such a cross. It's really important for all of us to really understand, like, people really are fighting invisible battles and bearing invisible crosses. This is not something that people just have written across their forehead. This is what people are really suffering from. I think I mentioned already just like the cloudiness of thought, inability to concentrate, losing track of what you were saying or thinking. And then these recurrent thoughts when it gets sort of heavy enough of death, suicidal ideation, just the general sense that life is not worth living kind of thing. And then obviously from there it increases. And so, thinking about certain plans and then sort of putting together things like having means and an action plan kind of thing. Like, obviously those are red flags. That's definitely, you're way beyond the time when you should be reaching out for help or somebody should be reaching out for help at that point. But if there has been no reaching out for help up to that point, then definitely reach out and talk to somebody about what's going on. So again, these need to be causing like actual impairment and distress in social situations, in vocational life and relational areas of life. And so these are the kinds of things that we look for to actually have a diagnosis. So you can see that this is a far cry from having a bad day or a little bit of worry or maybe a lot of worry. You could be so worried that you're losing sleep for 2 or 3 nights. That's considered normal, at least in terms of what's diagnosable on a clinical level. All right, so we have all these things that are sort of like the diagnosable side of things, obviously very related to everything else that happens on an undiagnosable side of things. In other words, normal human life. And so what can we do looking through this Catholic lens to understand how far we can go with our faith? Now, I want to make a point here that's really important. This is not to say that prayer is going to fix all these things alone. There's a lot of people who are suffering with being in faith communities who are looked down upon because they're suffering in these ways. And the idea is like, well, you're just not praying enough. You didn't do enough novenas. This is because you're living immorally. There must be something, if you're anxious, if you can't sleep at night, it must be a guilty conscience. That's what I've heard before. That's so upside down. It's so backwards. It's so wrong. Obviously, there might be a guilty conscience. And clearly, we all need to be doing an examination of conscience on a very regular basis, if not daily, at the least on a weekly basis, looking at our actions, looking at our life, looking at our relationships, taking an assessment, making sure that we are inviting God and the Holy Spirit to clarify and enlighten our hearts and show us where we can make improvements to live a better life. Yes. With that being said, somebody might be living a tip-top, ship-shape, absolutely pristine, clean, virtuous life and still be burdened with anxiety and or depression, may not be sleeping well at night, may be plagued with all sorts of attacks coming at them in the mind. And in fact, if we look at the lives of the saints, that's pretty normal. That's pretty normal. There's a lot of saints who suffered with scrupulosity, who suffered with anxiety, who suffered with depression, and the whole gamut of all these mental health issues. So none of this is to say, none of the work that I do in presenting a faith-based perspective is to say this is going to heal and eradicate all of your mental health issues. That would be a very disintegrated approach, and that would be pretty much the opposite of the mission of the Catholic Psych Institute and everything that I've done in my work. So that's not what I'm saying. However, at the same time, because Catholic both and always has to be here, it is also true that because of our faith, through the lens of our faith, because of our anthropology and our trust in Christ as a model for all humanity, we can take him at his word when he says, do not be anxious about the things of your life. There is a place and a level at which we can listen to his words, we can trust in divine providence, and God who's taking care of the flowers and the birds and loves us more than all of these, and that will give us a deep foundation and sense of peace. Now, peace is not the same as being without these clinical experiences. It's not the same as sleeping perfectly through the night every night. There may be an overlap. There may be a work in progress. Something that's very important to understand is we're talking about brains here. And outside of like an absolute supernatural miracle where God just has, there's a St. Paul struck off the horse, blinded and transformed in a moment kind of experience, most of us are traveling the path of a natural conversion, which is to say we're progressing little by little. So you could have in one moment complete clarity over your entire life, the full sort of, what do they call it? The illumination of conscience, and then like this full choosing of all that is good, holy, true, good, and beautiful. But we still have neural pathways that are developed over time, most of the cases from before we are actually even birthed into the world, prenatally developing these neural pathways that have been built up over time, which are a part of our anxiety system, our mood system, our hormones, all this stuff. That still needs time and takes time to transform. So we are works in progress, spiritually, physically, psychologically. And we have to take all of that into account. But all of that being said, what can we do today? What can we do right now? We can trust God's providence. There are 3 things about God that we should know by faith because of Christ's revelation: that God is all-knowing, he is all-powerful, and he is love itself, the infinite, eternal manifestation, existence of all that is love. And we are created out of that love. So we are known by God in his image, and he is protecting us and taking care of us, and all will be well. If you don't get the job, all will be well. If the relationship ends and somebody breaks up with you, or if you need to break up with somebody, or if something's happening with your kids, or if something's happening with your in-laws or your parents, or something's happening with COVID, or something's happening with the economy, whatever, on and on and on, all will be well. Period. That's what we can rest on. Something might be happening internally. I'm having a panic attack. All will be well. I am anxious about being in public. All will be well. I don't believe that all will be well. All will be well. We're works in progress. There's a lot to dig into and dive into. These are very deep mysteries that we are being drawn into. But this is what will bring us peace at the level at which we can experience it given our circumstances in this world. And even what those limitations are, maybe are beyond the scope of what we can even fully understand. And don't be fooled for a second to think that science understands it. Because I don't care if it's the DSM-5 or the DSM-55 and it's 300 years from now, science doesn't have all the answers. It can't. Because science only measures what is observable and measurable in the material world or the effects of the spiritual world. But it can't measure what's in the spiritual dimension, which is the most of eternity and most of existence. So the best we can do is listen to Jesus, follow the gospel, seek what is true, good, and beautiful, including the elements of truth that are contributed to from the sciences. All good, all well and good. Constantly knowing that God is in control. That is the most important truth that we can submit ourselves to. So a lot of this is the work that I do with Catholic Mindfulness, with what we have called the Catholic Mindfulness Virtual Retreat. So the virtual retreat is available at CatholicPsych.com. I forget. I think it's called. The link is store/store. But anyways, there's a tab at the top there for digital resources. And I'm not using this to try to promote stuff, but the point is, I've put together in that 8-week course. This is really sort of like the flagship hallmark of basically the integration work that we do, that I use with every single client, patient, mentee, person, and organization I've ever worked with. In these 8 weeks are encapsulated what I believe to be the most important things to build a foundation of psycho-spiritual health and well-being. And ultimately what it is a way to put into practice the practice of the presence of God. Into practice, Abandonment to Divine Providence, which is an amazing book. And Father de Caussade, also Father Jacques Philippe has written a bunch of stuff. Searching for and Maintaining Peace by Father Jacques Philippe. He gets a little bit more psychological than Father de Caussade, but these are spiritual works. We need a psychological manual, the how-to practical manual. What do I actually do on a day-to-day basis with my brain thinking these thoughts when these patterns emerge, when these experiences are happening? What am I supposed to actually do? So we can believe by faith why we should do something different, but we need to know what to do. So that's what this virtual retreat is. So I really encourage you to go check that out. CatholicPsych.com. You can find it on our digital resources, and that's the best way to understand where these overlaps are between our faith and our mental health and our experience as humans, being human. That's what this whole thing is about. Okay, so the last note that I wanted to just close the loop on here, because I was talking in the beginning about the overlap or the similarities between anxiety and depression. And why I put these both together is because at the root of both of these are ruminations that are contributed to physiologically, that we may or may not be able to control or stop. But at the level of the way we're thinking, we can counter some of these patterns of thinking. But it's really interesting because based on our dispositions, we all have very different constitutions. Some people are more extroverted, more introverted. Some people are more rational. Some people are more artistic. We have all these different things. Birth order matters. Are you firstborn, secondborn, thirdborn? All these different kinds of things. So it seems to be the case that some people, based on their constitution, when they have these ruminations, their system will overact in sort of like a ramping up of activity. And that is more of the anxiety side of things. And then some people, based on their dispositions, will start to underreact and slow down and go down into the more depressive side of things. And so we could see almost two sides of the same coin here. And it's really interesting to see what happens. And in fact, in the last DSM-5, which I don't particularly like, but they did actually say, they added a criteria to major depressive disorder, where they added a thing in there that says you might have anxious distress. So it's like this marker that they add to a diagnosis of major depressive disorder, which says like this might have gotten so bad now you're anxious. And anxiety disorders have within them this sort of like also this possibility of shutting down. And that's where we talked about the brain starts to get cloudy, starts to get this internal sort of like overwhelm turns into almost a shutting down. So normally anxious people might escalate to the point of overflowing and becoming depressed. Normally depressive people might escalate to the point of overflowing and becoming anxious. And so that's when like if you're a normally depressive person or sort of slow and lethargic or whatever, and then you're in such a deep rut that now you're starting to get anxious, it's like you've overflowed your cup of capacity for dealing with these mental health difficulties, and you really need some help. And then again, the opposite might be true for somebody who's normally anxious, and then they're actually just shutting down because they're so overwhelmed. Time for help. Time for a retreat. Time for a break. And some guided help, some professional help, whatever it might, maybe some medication. Sometimes that is necessary. So anyways, we want to put this all out there. I hope that this information has blessed you. I hope it's given you some things to think about. I hope that it's given you some compassion and empathy and some sympathy maybe for people you know who are suffering with these things. Please pray for those suffering with mental distress and mental health issues. Pray for our work here at the Catholic Psych Institute with our new mentorship model, with the Being Human podcast and the publishing and the newsletter and all the stuff, because this is what we're here for. We're trying to help people who are suffering in these ways. All right. Thank you for your prayers. Thank you for your support. Please look us up on iTunes, subscribe so you get all the episodes sent right to you. Give us a 5-star review. Let other people know about what we're doing here, and I'll be praying for you as well. Until next time, God bless you.